I didn't choose the wrong life. I let time choose it for me. That sounds harmless when you say it quickly. Almost reasonable. As if time were some wise authority that knows better than you do. But time doesn't care. It doesn't guide. It only moves. And while it moves, it takes things. I used to believe that if I waited long enough, clarity would arrive on its own. That one day I would wake up and know what to do. Who to be. Where to go. So I waited. I waited when I should have spoken. I waited when I should have left. I waited when my body was screaming and my mouth stayed polite. At first, waiting felt responsible. Calm. Adult. I told myself I was being careful. That rushing decisions ruins lives. That patience is a virtue. No one warns you that patience can rot into avoidance. From the outside, my life looked balanced. I was functioning. Presentable. Predictable. I did what was expected. I said the right things. I didn't cause trouble. Inside, something else was happening. I felt like my life was always about to begin, just not yet. Like I was standing in a hallway, suitcase in hand, waiting for a signal that never came. Every year I told myself, not now. Later. When things are clearer. Things never became clearer. They just became quieter. I remember a moment that should have scared me more than it did. Someone asked me where I saw myself in 5 years. I answered without thinking. The answer sounded reasonable. Safe. But while I was speaking, I realized something chilling. I didn't see anything. No image. No desire. No direction. Just words filling space. That was the first time I understood that I was narrating a life instead of living one. Time passed differently after that. Faster. Heavier. Days felt short, but years felt long. Long enough to notice that I was always in the same place internally. I watched people around me change. Not all of them for the better, but at least they moved. They failed. They restarted. They made mistakes they could point to. I had nothing to point to. Only absence. Opportunities came quietly and left politely. They didn't slam doors. They didn't demand answers. They waited just long enough, and then moved on. And every time, I told myself I hadn't missed anything important. That lie became easier to repeat. There's a specific kind of despair that doesn't look like sadness. It looks like neutrality. You stop reacting strongly. Stop wanting intensely. Stop resisting. You become reasonable at the cost of being alive. I didn't hate my life. That was the problem. Hate would have forced a decision. Instead, I felt mild disappointment stretched over years. Like background noise you stop noticing until it damages your hearing. At night, when the world was quiet enough, the questions came. What am I actually waiting for? How much time do I think I have? Who benefits from my silence? Those questions made me uncomfortable, so I drowned them out with routine. Wake up. Work. Distract. Sleep. Repeat. I wasn't unhappy enough to justify change. And not happy enough to feel fulfilled. That middle space is where people disappear without anyone noticing. Including themselves. I remember standing in front of a mirror one evening, trying to locate myself. Not my face, my presence. I looked familiar. But distant. Like someone I used to know. That was when the realization finally surfaced, slow, heavy, undeniable. Time wasn't waiting for me. It was moving forward, carrying my unused life with it. And I was cooperating by doing nothing. I had confused passivity with safety. Delay with wisdom. Silence with peace. In reality, I had outsourced my life to inertia. And inertia is ruthless. It doesn't hate you. It doesn't warn you. It just keeps going. And one day, you wake up and realize you've been present for everything, except your own becoming. That was the moment something inside me started to crack. Not loudly. But enough to make waiting unbearable. Once waiting becomes a habit, it starts to feel like identity. I didn't just wait for opportunities. I waited for permission. Permission to want something different. Permission to disrupt what was already built. Permission to admit that the life I was living didn't fit anymore. I kept expecting a sign, something undeniable. A breaking point dramatic enough to justify action. It never came. Life rarely gives you clear signals. It gives you slow discomfort and watches what you do with it. The discomfort grew quietly. Not as pain, but as a constant pressure. I noticed it in small things. In how every plan for the future felt abstract. In how I avoided imagining myself happy, as if happiness required too many explanations. In how I answered questions about my life with practiced neutrality. I wasn't lying. I was withholding. I began to understand that waiting had changed me. It made me cautious. It made me flexible. It made me very good at adapting to circumstances I didn't choose. Adaptation looks like strength from the outside. Inside, it feels like erosion. I stopped trusting my impulses. Any desire that appeared, I interrogated until it disappeared. Is this realistic? Is this necessary? Is this selfish? Eventually, nothing survived the questioning. There's a moment in prolonged indecision when your inner voice becomes quiet. Not because it agrees, but because it's tired of being ignored. That silence scared me more than doubt ever had. I realized I no longer knew the difference between fear and intuition. Between caution and avoidance. Everything felt the same, muted. I tried to convince myself this was peace. It wasn't. Peace feels alive. This felt anesthetized. I remember a night when the weight finally became too heavy to ignore. I was alone, surrounded by the life I had carefully maintained. Nothing was wrong. And that's what made it unbearable. I asked myself a question I had avoided for years. If nothing changes, how many more years will I give to this version of my life? The answer came immediately. Too many. That answer scared me. Because it meant the danger wasn't sudden collapse, it was continuity. I started noticing how time moved faster the less I used it intentionally. Weeks vanished. Months folded into each other. I had memories, but few moments. The realization hit me slowly, like a bruise forming. I had confused stability with safety. Stability just means things don't move. Safety requires alignment. And I wasn't aligned with my own existence anymore. The moral dilemma revealed itself without drama. To change, I would have to disturb people. Disrupt routines. Break expectations that I had helped create. Waiting had made me reliable. Leaving would make me unpredictable. That terrified me. I didn't want to be the source of discomfort. I didn't want to explain myself. I didn't want to be questioned. So I waited a little longer. But now waiting hurt. Every day felt like a conscious choice to disappear slowly. I began to understand something cruel. Time doesn't punish you for waiting. It rewards your inaction by making it permanent. The longer you delay, the more difficult movement becomes, not because you're incapable, but because you've built a life around not moving. I stood at the edge of that realization for weeks. Afraid to step forward. Afraid to stay. Then one thought cut through everything. If I continue like this, I won't have a dramatic regret. I'll have a quiet one. The kind you feel when it's too late to fix anything. That thought broke something open inside me. I didn't suddenly become brave. I didn't feel confident. But for the first time, waiting felt more dangerous than acting. And that changed the balance. I still didn't know what to do. But I knew one thing with painful clarity. If I let time decide for me any longer, there would be nothing left to decide. I didn't stop waiting because I became confident. I stopped waiting because I became afraid of what would happen if I didn't. There is a point where patience stops being virtue and becomes surrender. I had crossed it without noticing. The decision didn't arrive as certainty. It arrived as exhaustion. I was tired of rehearsing futures I never entered. Tired of explaining a life that didn't feel lived. Tired of being almost ready. So I did something small and irreversible. I made a choice without knowing how it would end. Not a dramatic one. Not the kind people applaud. I chose movement. I allowed myself to act before clarity arrived. That felt illegal. We're taught that responsible people wait until everything makes sense. But nothing meaningful in my life had ever made sense before it happened. Waiting had only made me smaller. Acting made me visible. The first steps felt clumsy. Unconvincing. Even embarrassing. I doubted myself constantly. Was this impulse or intuition? Was I running or finally walking forward? Was I too late to matter? Those questions didn't disappear. But they stopped controlling me. I began to notice how different time felt when I was no longer negotiating with it. Days stretched again. Moments became distinct. I felt fear more sharply, but also presence. Waiting had protected me from fear. It had also protected me from meaning. Some people didn't understand my change. Some didn't want to. I had trained them to expect stability, not honesty. Breaking that contract came with consequences. Disappointment. Distance. Silence where there used to be comfort. That hurt. But for the first time, the pain felt aligned. I wasn't suffering because I was disappearing. I was suffering because I was becoming. There were nights I missed the old life, not because it was right, but because it was familiar. Familiarity is persuasive. It tells you that you were safer before, even when you were numb. I had to remind myself why I stopped waiting. Because waiting had cost me years I would never get back. Because time had never rewarded my caution. Because postponement had quietly stolen my identity. Starting over didn't feel like freedom. It felt like standing in open space with no instructions. No guarantees. No map. Just responsibility. That's the part no one romanticizes. When you stop letting time decide, you become accountable for the outcome. There's no one left to blame. That weight was terrifying. But it was also grounding. For the first time, my life felt authored instead of inherited. I began listening to myself again, awkwardly, imperfectly. I noticed what energized me. What drained me. What felt true even when it was inconvenient. I made decisions that didn't look impressive from the outside. But they felt honest. And honesty has momentum. I still think about the life I almost lived, the one built entirely on waiting. The version of me who believed that clarity comes before action. Who thought time would eventually explain everything. Time explains nothing. It only passes. If you're listening to this and you feel suspended, like your real life is just ahead of you, I need you to hear this. There is no future version of you who will magically be braver. There is no perfect moment waiting to arrive. There is only now, quietly asking what you're doing with it. Waiting feels safe because it doesn't ask for courage. But it demands a price. Years. Possibilities. Versions of yourself that never get a chance to exist. I didn't ruin my life by choosing wrong. I almost ruined it by letting time choose for me. And the moment I stopped waiting, not because I was ready, but because I was tired of disappearing, time didn't slow down. But it finally became mine.